Hi, I'm Bill Furlong, and along with my colleague, Dr. Mary Crossan, we co-host our new podcast called A Question of Character, where we answer all of your questions about the Ivey Leader Character Framework. Yes, you heard me right. We answer them all. So we would like to welcome you to our first episode, and we are delighted that you can join us. Question of Character has 4 different objectives. To promote awareness and understanding of the Ivey Leader Character Framework. Second, to inform and persuade people about the importance of leader character to their personal and professional well-being. Third, to provide a library of answers, resources, and references to address commonly asked questions about leader character. And fourth and finally, to stimulate interest in and inspiration for individuals and organizations to pursue developing and incorporating leader character within themselves and their organizations. So now I'd like to introduce you to my co-host. She is a distinguished university professor, Western University's highest honor recognizing excellence in teaching, research, and service. She teaches in the Ivey Business School undergraduate, MBA, PhD, and executive programs. And for those of you who don't know about the Ivey Business School, it is very highly regarded. For example, for 6 years running, Bloomberg Businessweek has ranked Ivey the #1 MBA program in Canada. That's from 2014 to 2019. Her research on organizational learning, strategy, leadership character, and improvisation has been widely published in such prestigious journals as the Strategic Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, and the Journal of Management Studies. She is the author of several books, including Developing Leadership Character and more than 50 cases. She is my co-host, Dr. Mary Crossan. So Mary, welcome. And it is such a pleasure to have you join me as co-host for our new podcast.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be with you on this.
So Mary, let's start with how did you get involved with leader character in the first place?
Well, it goes back to 2008. I was then the head of a research center at Ivey. The economic crisis had hit, and we actually asked the question, well, what were the failures of leadership and how did we contribute to it as a business school? So we held these focus groups all across Canada, the US, Europe, Asia, and there were about 350 leaders involved in these various focus groups. We were asking this question, what had gone wrong? Myself, Gerard Seitz, Jeffrey Gantz were the key players in this. And we found in those discussions that people were always implicating character. But the problem was they didn't know how to define it. They didn't know whether you could develop it. And they really returned to us and said, can't you guys figure this out? So, Bill, that was really the starting point. And I have to say that for myself, Gerard, and Jeffrey, we were all fully involved in other areas of research and teaching. But what we heard was so profound that it really grabbed our attention, and we turned our attention towards understanding this problem.
So my understanding is during the course of those interviews, I think I recall Jeffrey talking about this, is that you would try and move on to other elements. Okay, well, we've talked about character. Let's actually talk about something else. And my understanding is that the groups and the individuals kept on bringing it back to character. It was such a profound, integral, important element of what they thought had gone wrong.
That's right, Bill. It was really quite stunning, and this sort of sense that we got. Thank goodness I was a part of what was going on, and I could hear the passion and interest, because I'm not sure I would have pivoted what I was doing to try to solve this problem had I not been there and witnessed it.
Right.
But, Bill, look at you. You're not an academic. I mean, this is a whole different story for you. How did this, intrigue you, or how did you get involved?
Well, Mary, I like to think of myself maybe as a closet academic. It's always been something that I've been interested in, is the academic side of business and business management. My background is mostly a capital markets guy. I mean, I've done lots of different things. I was involved in a research and development company. I worked for a car company for a while. I've been a regulator, but the bulk of my career has been spent really in capital markets. For a while, I ran a securitization business globally for a Canadian bank. I've also was involved in the oversight and governance of their trading businesses on a global basis. And in 2013, I retired as vice chair. And I was really left with some time in my hands. And so I thought I'd go back to my old alma mater, or my old school, my alma mater, which was the Ivey Business School, and asked them if they had something for an old capital markets guy to maybe work on. And that's when I met Gerard. And Gerard had shared with me an article, or a book actually, that he had written called Leadership on Trial, a manifesto for leadership development, which kind of sounds a bit Marxist when I first sort of looked at it, but I sat down and read it, and I instantly bought in because it focused on character, all of those things you just described around what happened and what went wrong and how can we solve it. For me, the value of any sort of theory is really how much does it explain? And for me, as I began to look at the work that you and Gerard and Jeffrey were doing, it just made perfect sense. I instantly was able to start to see, not only in myself, but in other people as well, the reasons for some of the decisions and judgments that made, why some leaders flourished, while others struggled or plateaued. And it explains so much. And in particular, it started getting at this X factor, if you will, of character. Everyone knows character is important, but this started to take it from something which was objective, or subjective, to something which is objective. And what I bring, I guess, to the table, Mary, is this practitioner's perspective, which I guess you and Gerard and Jeffrey must value because you continue to keep me around. The framework itself, though, is something which has stayed with me. So I've read many different kind of management books, self-help books, different theories around leadership, and they've been interesting, but none has stayed with me the way that the Leader Character Framework has. It's something that I find I can use to diagnose issues and then almost prescribe treatment in a way to myself and learn to sort of grow and develop. And I've seen significant changes in myself and my outcomes as a result of that. So maybe we can talk maybe for just a moment, Mary, around our podcast format. So this episode and the next one really are kind of like Leader Character 101 A and B, if you will. This is where we sort of create set an introduction for you around leader character. And it's almost this foundation we want to sort of give to you so that the rest of the podcast episodes is something that we can build on. The content that we'll discuss today and go through today is very similar to the content that Mary and I do in these half-day workshops around leadership character that we've done in Canada, in the UK, and in the US as well. And Mary's actually done a number of workshops like this as well throughout Asia. So the content is going to be very similar to that. And thereafter, we're going to follow really 4 different lines of thinking or pursuit of questions in really 4 different quadrants, if you will. One will be to learn more about the Leader Character Framework itself. So we'll sort of start doing some deep dives, how the framework hangs together, things like why is judgment at the center. And then we'll spend some time looking at how you can develop leadership character in yourself. So I'll focus on an individual, how you can assess where you currently are with respect to leadership character, and what you can do about growing those dimensions of character that are of most interest to you. And then looking at taking it from the individual to the organization. How can you take leadership character and embed it into an organization? What's the effective context? What's the effective culture of an organization? How does a part of the organization like human resources get involved? How does risk get involved, or compliance, or the front lines? And then finally, we'll connect leadership character to other frameworks that are out there or other kinds of concepts around leadership. And we can answer some questions as how is it different, say, than personality? How does it contrast with other forms of the leadership styles? How does it contrast, for example, with emotional intelligence? How is it different than that? How does it add different value? So we'll go in those 4 different directions of those 4 different quadrants that I spoke about. Throughout those episodes, we'll bring in guests. We'll also be using as much as possible different examples of both individuals and organizations where we've seen real change in terms of the quality of decision making that people make and the outcomes that they get. Which brings me, I guess, to the reason why you should listen to this podcast in our view. And it's really a fairly straightforward proposition. Our view is the stronger the character that you have, the better decisions and judgments you're going to make. The better decisions and judgments you make, that will improve performance and outcomes in all aspects of your life, not just your professional life, but also your personal life. And that will lead to increased or better performance, both professionally, but also better life satisfaction and also better well-being. So it's a very powerful yet simple idea. And that's what we hope to bring to you with these podcasts going forward.
Bill, I think I would just reinforce this point that in my 35 years working in the field of management and in organizations, I don't think I've ever seen anything as powerful as leader character to deliver on the kinds of things, Bill, that you've just talked about. Issues about well-being, issues about quality of judgment and decision-making, errors of judgment and decision-making, which get you into areas of risk and compliance in organizations. I think we've worked literally with thousands of leaders, and you really don't find anybody who comes up and says, "Oh, I don't see a place for leader character." I remember one leader saying to me once, "This is like having wheels on a suitcase. How did we ever, manage without having wheels on a suitcase? It's like one of those things that becomes obvious once you see it." But we went for a long period of time not being able to employ it.
Fabulous, Mary. I completely agree with you. Once you start to look at it, so many of the different problems and or opportunities that I run into now, when I look at it through the leader character lens, if you will, new perspectives and new insights always pop up. And I just think it's remarkable work that's baseline to practically everything that we do, which is not a surprise because character is regarded, I think, by one and all as being foundational to life success and to who we are as people going forward. So with that, Mary, maybe we can start getting into now the leader character framework. And I've got a couple of questions to really sort of set the baseline, if you will, so that when we get more into the leader character wheel that we'll talk about, we've got a bit of a better foundation. The first thing, I wonder if you could spend a bit of time just talking about the difference between moral character compared to virtuous character.
Yeah, Bill, it's a really good question because I think a lot of people, when they think about character, they think about being a good person or a bad person, more from an ethical sense. And they lose sight of the fact, as we just talked about, that the real backbone of character, coming from Aristotelian notions of character, is about well-being and practical wisdom, or what we call judgment. So you will apply character for sure. It can be applied to ethics, but just keeping it in the domain of morality or ethics would be shortchanging what it is that character can provide.
Right. So with that then, could you maybe address the 4 misconceptions that commonly come up when we speak to people around leader character?
Well, I think the point we just talked about leads to the first misconception, that it's you're going to be undermined if you act with character. It's like operating with one hand behind your back, as people would say, that your performance will suffer. And in fact, that's not the case whatsoever. We talk about you're acting with one hand behind your back if you're not acting with character. So we pick up that character operates with competence hand in hand to deliver performance. So Bill, I think the first misconception is around its link to performance,
right.
And that you need character to be able to do that. A second misconception is about the fact that you can't develop character. So people have this notion that you're born with it or you develop it at a very early age and then it's set. Well, that's absolutely not the case. Plenty of research to show that your character, because it's a habit of being, is something that's constantly evolving. And in fact, if we don't understand that, we have the risk of atrophying our character in inappropriate ways. Another misconception is about the fact that it's something you can't measure. It's all subjective. But when we look at character, it's about observable behaviors. These habits of being are a set of observable behaviors, very well defined. We can get into some of the background of the research, but a set of criteria that establishes these behaviors as virtuous in their orientation. We can observe them gold standard around how you deal with some psychometric properties of a particular phenomenon. And if we can observe those behaviors, we can measure, build them, and then we can manage them. The last one I would say is, because we use the term leader character, people think about it as, well, this only applies when you're the CEO or senior leader of an organization. Whereas we use the term leadership to reinforce that it's about the disposition to lead and less about the position to lead. You certainly need character when you have the position to lead, but all of us need character. You know, Bill, at the outset, you talked about how important it is in our personal life. And I think anybody who has kids knows that you're less about developing their competence and more about developing their character. And then when you apply this notion of disposition to lead, they're not supervising anybody, but they sure need the disposition to lead to navigate this complex world that we live in. Bill, so those would be about the four real key misconceptions.
Thank you, Mary. That's great. And each one of those, well, some of those misconceptions, for example, will actually form episodes of their own. So the idea of, can character change? We get that question all the time, because I think people are sort of skeptical about that. But I think that episode, that podcast episode, will actually go through that, the anatomy of that and how it changes, and different examples. So I'm very much looking forward to those episodes going forward. The last thing I'd like to describe, or ask you to describe, Mary, a little bit, is around the 3 C's of leadership: competencies, commitment, and character. And I'm wondering if you can maybe just spend a bit of time with that. And now for our listeners as well, and our viewers, we'll provide a link to that, to the podcast page at the end, so you'll be able to reference that. But if you could just maybe talk about those 3 C's of leadership.
Sure. So let's start with competencies. They're the bread and butter of a business school, teaching competencies as it is in organizations. And we typically bucket leadership competencies into 4 areas. I think the one that everybody focuses on is people competencies. We think about leadership as leading others, motivating others, trying to develop capacity in others. Well, we often forget there are other competencies, like the organizational competencies, the stewardship that we all have to ensure that the systems and processes, routines, practices of the organization support what it is that we hope to accomplish. And sometimes we lose sight of that as leaders. We often get pretty clear on our business competencies because they're often very technical in their orientation, could be finance or marketing or operations management. So those business competencies are pretty clearly defined, and usually by the job that we have. Then we do often lose sight of strategic competencies. So even at lower levels of an organization, having that strategic overview for the work that we do, which helps set priorities and focus energy and attention. So that competency space is reasonably well understood. And what we want to pick up is that character has been this missing link. How do we elevate character alongside competency? There is the 3rd C, which is commitment to lead. And we may at a subsequent podcast talk about that, because we often assume that if somebody's in a leadership position, they're committed, but that's not the case. And to some degree, your character will affect your commitment, because you may lack courage or you may lack accountability, and that will affect your commitment to lead. But commitment is a whole other area to consider, Bill.
So, I mean, sometimes, Mary, we look at the 3 C's. I think I've looked at it, and maybe you have the same way, is that although there's these 3 different areas of these 3 C's that are associated with leadership, in many ways I think, maybe you think as well, is that character is not only foundational, but perhaps the most important in terms of outcomes. And so, I've come to the point where I think that character leverages competencies and commitment. And a good example there was the 08-09 financial crisis. There was no shortage of people, extremely competent people, working extremely hard, but ultimately ended up producing outcomes that were poor for all of us, and goes back to the idea that character was really the thing that was missing back in those days, and that because in that sense you can think about how character was the absence or the weakness of character actually leveraged down outcomes, where you could imagine the exact same people working extremely hard with those competencies that they had, but working with strong character, and you would produce completely different outcomes. And so the character has this leveraging effect, either up or down. And so to me, that makes it foundational in terms of this framework, because it affects the other two so profoundly.
I would say too, you might want to think about it. Sometimes we talk about it as in a tree metaphor, where character is like the roots of the tree, creating this really foundational system
Right.
That infuses the trunk of the tree. You could think about that as the culture of the organization with the strength that you'd be looking for. So when organizations say they value integrity or they value accountability, these are statements about what they want. But the issue is, who are you that can deliver on that? And then if we think about that, as you've just described, Bill, like the competencies as the branches of the tree, your strength of character will fundamentally influence the competency. So the space I've worked in for most of my life is strategic renewal. And we know there that failures of strategy are rarely failures of competence, but largely failures of character, which I believe is also what was coming out of the 2008 analysis of the economic crisis.
And that's going to be one of our podcasts going forward, as well as the application of leader character framework to misconduct issues. And in particular, the area that I'm most focused on is in financial services, and how we see again that these issues around that we've seen in financial markets rarely have to do with competence and are almost always character-based. So with that, Mary, maybe a little bit of now we can get into the work itself. Could you maybe spend a moment or two just talking about the source of the leader character work? Where did it come from? What was the work that you were building upon yourself?
Well, it was a bit of a daunting experience, I have to say, coming out of that economic crisis and say, so where do we start on this? Of course, we leverage our capability as academics to understand its scholarship. So of course we're reaching back. Well, all of a sudden we're into all of philosophy,
Right.
and Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and of course people spend their lives in those areas. So it's pretty daunting. Then we had a moment that was phenomenal, where we discovered the work of Martin Seligman, former president of the American Psychological Association, and Christopher Peterson, who had written this 800-page research book called Character, Strengths, and Virtues. They had gone looking across cultures, across religions, across time, with a set of 10 criteria that they used to identify certain behaviors as virtuous in their orientation. And Bill, I think this is a really important point for our listeners. It may not ring true right away, but I think it's something to contemplate, is that there are very few management theories that have a normative orientation. And normative means how should they be?
Right.
What is something that tells us, in this case, something that this is the possibility of where things could be, a very normative stance on things, whereas most of our theories, particularly on individual personality, are descriptive in their orientation. How do we tease apart our differences? And of course, we do tie those differences to performance outcomes, but we're not saying being a man or being a woman is different, or being an extrovert or an introvert is better. They are differences. And I think the starting point is just to say the origins of character in virtue ethics comes from this normative background. And then thankfully, we had this tremendous work of Peterson and Seligman, who had really done a lot of heavy lifting around establishing what I would say is a really good foundation from philosophy into psychology.
Right.
Now, the thing was, they were interested in well-being, individual well-being largely, and individual sustained excellence. Our interest was to bring that into organizations, into management theory. So the moment we did that, we ran into trouble. So we had taken their framework and approach, and we found there was pushback. And I'll give you some small examples just to give you a sense of why we ran into trouble. Under the dimension of humanity, there was a word called love. And I would say 50% of the people that we worked with thought it was fantastic, and 50% were just really shut down and saying, what has this got to do with leadership in organizations? So that kind of problem was throughout the framework. What we wanted to do was honor the underlying theory. So things like empathy and compassion were ways for us to be able to capture something like love that was in the original framework, but we felt was off-putting and wouldn't allow us to move forward. So Bill, the original work then kind of went through that period of time. We had 6 years of engaged scholarship working with over 1,000 leaders to meld together an approach that honored the theory but could be used in practice, and it became that leader character framework, which we were able to develop self-assessments, 360 assessments, and a variety of tools around it.
So is it fair to say then that using the framework that Peterson and Sullivan had developed, you then sort of took that and evolved it into a framework that was useful for organizations and leadership in the broader sense, and that's to me was something which is really where there's a ton of value in that, because you took something which was, I guess, more theoretical or academic, and you've actually made it quite practical and useful for everyday use. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's fair to say, but I also would say their work was practical if it was individual well-being you were only interested in. And I would say that we didn't lose that individual well-being, that we retained that. I think the fact that we were able to take away the divide between personal and professional life. So people saw this framework applying to them personally and professionally, and that created something that really extended, I think, and amplified the original work that they had done.
Now, I think we should take a moment as well as to let people know is that your transformation of that work, it wasn't a case of yourself, Gerard and Jeffrey and other colleagues that you worked with then sort of settled in on that and thought, well, this is kind of what we like or didn't like. You then embarked upon a serious course, I guess, or process of going through some of the best academic journals in the world to have your articles reviewed, peer-reviewed, and published over a period of, I guess, when I think about it now, I guess 7 or 8 years now. And that this peer-reviewed research makes it, people can be confident that the framework that they're using rests upon a very solid academic and research foundation. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right, Bill. I think we would characterize the work as deep theory to deep practice.
Right.
And I often talk about, you don't want to be standing on quicksand when you're making major investments in an organization and pivoting around elevating character alongside competence, which was our original aspiration coming out of that 2008 economic crisis. So it wasn't just coming up with that framework. It's been literally ongoing research day in and day out, where we keep building and addressing and thinking about what's the next piece of the puzzle that we want to look at to help people understand how character operates in organizations.
Fantastic. And I'm hoping, again, in future podcasts, we can sort of touch on some of that research. Now it might be the time, I think, to maybe talk about the leader character framework and this sort of a wheel shape that we have. If you're watching the video, we'll put up the diagram. There's a schematic. If not, we'll attach it as a link on our podcast page, and you can look at it there. Mary, maybe you can take a few moments to walk us through the essence of that framework, if you will, and in particular, the ideas around the central role that judgment has, and the virtue vice problem.
Sure. So for those of you listening, think about this wheel as operating a little bit like a clock. And at 12 o'clock, you have the construct of transcendence. And we're going to work around, I'll give you all the names of the dimensions of character. So you've got transcendence and drive, you've got collaboration, humanity, humility. And as you come to 6 o'clock, you've got integrity. Then we move around, we've got temperance, justice, accountability, and courage. All of those dimensions have supporting behaviors that help us understand what that dimension of character is about. And as Bill just described, judgment is in the middle, or what Aristotle talked about as practical wisdom. The reason it's in the middle is that it draws on all the other dimensions of character to inform quality of judgment and decision making. The importance of this is that there's so many models out there, leadership theories and others, that are about contingent approaches. You know, in a crisis, you need this kind of leader. In steady state, you need this. And this aspect or approach to leader character is not about the context that you're in. It really doesn't matter whether it's crisis or steady state. Your quality of judgment and decision making needs to rely on these various dimensions of character. So let me just take judgment for a moment. There are aspects or behaviors that we're familiar with, being analytical, decisive, cognitively complex. These are very important facets, things I think that have been developed in higher education. But if those aspects of judgment are not informed by strength of things like humility and humanity and justice, our judgment is incredibly narrow-minded. And of course, we see all sorts of problems today, areas like systemic discrimination and harassment that can be based and just understood simply by the fact that there are people who are taking decisions and actions, but not on the basis of these dimensions of character. So I think that's also important to understand that any one of these dimensions operates like a vice, as Aristotle would have said, in excess or deficiency. But when he was talking about excess or deficiency, he didn't mean some kind of average level of these dimensions of character. So when he began to talk about, well, courage in its excess is recklessness, and in its deficiency, cowardice, he didn't mean, well, just kind of dumb down your courage to get to an average level. It would be, if you're going to have that strength of courage, you're going to need also strength in something like temperance that has self-regulation, patience, and calm. You're going to need strength in areas like accountability, humanity, humility, all of those to ensure that, again, working through judgment, that courage is working in the best possible way for you. And Bill, I think this becomes an aha moment for a lot of individuals and organizations, because we've had these implicit models of leadership and effectiveness that we've actually overweighted on some dimensions of character and underweighted others. I don't think anybody would have thought of integrity operating like a vice. But if you look at some of those behaviors of integrity, being authentic, candid, transparent, principled, and consistent, you realize, well, geez, if I haven't worked something like justice, my principles can become very narrow in terms of how I exercise them. So I'm consistent and I'm principled. They're my principles, and they're not very informed in their orientation. And then I take something like my candor. Well, great, I'm bold and I have courage to tell you what I think. But what if I lack humility and humanity in order to do that? So I am actually operating like a bully in the organization. And here we now have a way for individuals to begin to identify something that looked like style in the past. You know, say, oh, they were a little abrasive, a little rough around the edges, but we didn't have any capacity to address it. Here, we understand it as a set of behaviors that influence judgment, and that judgment when it's not well formed is a risk factor in the organization. And I think, Bill, the moment we start talking about risk in organization, the more we can no longer turn a blind eye to these aspects of style. But importantly, let's go back to the development side of things, is that even I, as a leader who really didn't understand what I thought were my strengths, are now acting like advice. Well, the way I can move forward is to begin to augment and develop strength in these other areas. An example for me is I'm very strong on things like transcendence and courage and drive, but discovered through this work is that my temperance was a very limiting factor. So I become impatient, right? With the speed with which others would move at things, I became intolerant about things. I discovered I was lacking in humanity because I couldn't position myself to really understand why others couldn't see what I could see. And so I had to really, and still do, have to elevate things like humanity and temperance to ensure that things like courage, transcendence, and drive don't operate like a vice.
That's fabulous, Mary. And it's so, that to me was such an insight or a revelation in a way when I first looked at the framework. I remember looking at it and seeing things like justice and humanity and humility. And having coming from a capital markets background, I thought, like, who needs that? Like, that's just going to get you in trouble. And what I began to realize as I began to learn more about the framework is that it's exactly the weaknesses in those areas, or the the weaknesses in those areas, the less of that dimension or element that you need, that actually creates the poor judgments, that leads to the problems, that leads to people plateauing in their careers, that leads to them making decisions that subsequently turn out not to be good decisions because they weren't able to bring some aspects of their character to bear. And I was delighted to see it because, you know, you sort of have this sense that these elements or these dimensions are important. But in the broader sense, I think, you know, conventionally and historically, is that we do always look for the courageous leader, you know, the person that changes everything. That's that the damn the torpedoes kind of military leader, and we're going to go ahead at all costs. And that's the kind of leadership that privileges things like courage. And we miss out the humility that's necessary, and the humanity that's necessary, and this sense of justice. And I think that's what really creates this opportunity for sustainable excellence and this idea of well-being in all parts of your life. So to me, it was fundamentally different than anything that I'd seen before.
And Bill, I think that triggers for me this notion that we discovered in this, that a lot of people imagined some of these dimensions of character always in their virtuous state. So they just assumed integrity was virtuous, and courage and drive and accountability. They actually never imagined them in their vice state. Whereas things like humanity, collaboration, and humility and temperance, they think of them in their vice state, and they
Right.
have a hard time understanding them in their virtuous state. And I think that for a listener, just asking yourself the question, have you fallen into that trap, which most of us have, is a really important place to start moving in the direction to understand both how what we thought was virtuous operates like a vice, and how what we thought was a vice is actually operating really virtuous. Bill, another thing that you said reminds me to pick up on maybe a misconception that we hadn't drawn on previously, but relates to this, is that we all have examples of leaders that we say, oh my goodness, you know, but what about so-and-so? And, you know, Steve Jobs often comes up as an example for me when I'm talking about character. And what I pick up on is that we look at somebody like Steve Jobs, there were many times where he was not effective, right? So we get these aspects of, this isn't a story about this heroic leader. And what I ask people to imagine is, what if he could have strengthened his humility, humanity, collaboration, temperance, some areas that he might have been weak on, that if strengthening those things, he might have averted some of the poor judgment that occurred. And it would never have taken away from that great drive and courage and transcendence that he had. So we never want to think about these things as, dumbing down or diminishing an aspect of who we are, but actually strengthening another area to actually reap the full benefits of something that is really near and dear to us.
The last thing I'd like to talk about before we sort of go to our summary is there's three different types of character, I think, that you've identified. Strong, weak, and compromised. Could you maybe just spend a moment talking about those three different classifications, I guess?
Right, Bill. I mean, those 11 dimensions work together, and that sounds really complicated. And people think, oh, can you not get it down to 4 or 5? Are there some more important than others? We say no, but you might want to think about them more like an archetype. That you can think of yourself, others that you're working with around generally weak character. You may not have been in a position where you've strengthened them, in fact, they may have been weakened over a long period of time. Conversely, there's a lot of things, as that saying goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is that a lot of us have been really tested around character and may have been in positions where we've actually been able to strengthen our character over a long period of time. So individuals with weak character, strong character, more likely we're in this category of, we use two different words, sometimes compromised character or unbalanced character. It's where you've got these strengths in some areas that are not supported by the dimensions of character in others, and lead to these kind of chronic kinds of problems where you find yourself suffering both in your performance and in your well-being. And that becomes, I think, a really important area of development, Bill, both the weak area and also this unbalanced area.
Right. All right, Mary. Well, this might be a good point to break and maybe just summarize what we've gotten to, where we've come so far. There's a lot there I think for people to digest. So we'll just talk about a little bit and talk about sort of some of the key points really from today. First of all is the value of the leader character framework, the idea of defining character in the context of leadership and organizations, a very practical way to work and understand leadership character. The second thing is it's a very accessible framework, and we'll talk about that more in the next episode. Thirdly, how it's changing the conversation around leadership, Mary. And this is actually an article that you and your colleagues have written, I think in 2012 or 2013, won a prestigious award for Article of the Year. And that one of the reasons I think you'd mentioned in the past as to why it was so well received is because it's a way to integrate what everyone knows is important about leadership, character, and it allows it then to change the conversation away from competencies to also include character. Fourthly, it's a very powerful competitive advantage that you can control. Your character is really up to you, the decisions that you make and the actions and the behaviors that you take. And then the last point being is that everyone has a character. And it's something which you can change. And we'll talk about that going forward, just because you can actually change habits. If you're going to have a character, and it's really important, why not intentionally and intelligently look to develop it and to grow it and to improve it? You're going to, resulting with better outcomes in your personal and professional life, and it's going to improve your well-being and those who are around you. So that's what all this work is about. And Mary, due to the work of yourself and others, it really is taking off exponentially across a wide variety of different sectors, industries, and geographies. And I'm delighted, of course, to be a part of it.
We've talked about a lot of things, and as a listener, you're thinking, "Oh, where do I start, or how do I think?" And of course, we'll help in these podcasts step through a variety of aspects. But one of the ways you might think about it in a Venn diagram with 3 circles is that we talk about the investment in leader character. First thing is develop awareness, which is why the reason for this podcast. It's how do you start to get the language around character, think about it as the anatomy and physiology of the body. You've got this sort of way of understanding it. Second circle is around development. And there's a lot to be learned in terms of development and 360 assessments in the development of character. Then we go to the third circle, which is embedding character in the organization, institutionalizing it in your HR practices, in around values and ethics, around your risk management, around your strategy, around diversity and inclusion. So weaving it, the language of character into these other important mechanisms, Bill. So I think those three areas are really a good way to bucket how you think about the investment of character. And so if I go to the development side, one of the new things that we've really focused on is to say, how do we go beyond the podcasts and the workshops and the train the trainer that we have in organizations that bring these moments of understanding character, which happen, in some organizations on a reasonably regular basis. But we wanted to think about the development of character equivalent to really physical exercise. If I'm going to look at exercise and nutrition, I'm thinking about those things on a daily basis. So we want to think about the development of character on a daily basis. And there, Bill, I think one of the new exciting initiatives that will be pilot tested in a few organizations in the fall is a leader character development app that will look at the needs, define the needs of learning for an individual, and help them on a daily basis be able to develop character. And why I think these things are important is that, you listen to a podcast like this and you want to go from, oh, those are interesting ideas, into the really practical ways that you can move forward. And our aim in pulling this material together is to go from this initial podcast, but to start to lay the bricks in the road that can help people get there and develop that strength of character on a daily basis.
That's fantastic, Mary. You shared a beta version of that with me, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. I can't wait to see it in full production. And the idea, again, is that just like exercising, you can't get fit watching someone else work out. Like, this is really much, the development of character is really something that you have to personally engage in order to change the behaviors that will allow you to grow the character dimensions that you need to grow. And so I think the application that you're developing is exactly on point for achieving that kind of change. So in our next episode, we're going to be talking a bit more about the leader character dimensions. We're going to practice identifying them. And what we're going to do is we're going to use some movie clips, which is kind of tricky in a podcast, and it might be worth it just to tune in for that. But Mary and I will describe some movie clips from a movie that we've picked out, or Mary has picked out, that really exemplifies and shows you how easy it is to identify character dimensions, the impact of those dimensions and the strength in those dimensions in terms of the judgments that are being made and the outcomes that result from that. And I hope you'll see, like really all the presentations that Mary and I do, again, thousands of leaders over the years, they immediately look at the framework and it all of a sudden becomes something which is quite understandable and applicable and something that you can use to identify, classify, if you will, and understand how these dimensions affect people in everyday circumstances. It really is not that hard. So thank you again for joining us today, especially because this is our first podcast. If you've liked what you've heard today, please share with your friends and colleagues. If you really liked what you heard today, then please consider subscribing to our podcast. We also have a website, questionofcharacter.com, where we'll be posting various resources and articles, and in particular, links to any diagrams, schematics, or movie clips that are included in today or future podcasts. We'll also post links to the Ian Ina Towitz Institute for Leadership at the Ivey Business School, where there are even more resources, articles, and information about the Ivey Leader Character Framework. Thank you again for joining us today. It's goodbye from me.
Until next time.
Thank you.